Thank you. Welcome to A Taste of Music Hall. Unfortunately, I've sadly only got about a third of the time I normally have. It's about the music hall days. I intersperse with a little bit of music. I'll get in what I can in the 25 minutes or so I've got, but I'll try not to rush it. I'll have to cut bits out. But a night out in the music hall was this country's #1 form of entertainment for something like 70 years. Started in the pubs, moved out of the pubs into special halls, some purpose-built, some adapted. And like Topsy, it grew. Within something like 20 years, we got something like 500 music halls in the United Kingdom. This is round about the 1870s. These were known as the good old days, an absolute misnomer. They were horrendous. The working classes really were, it was poverty, and life expectancy was as low as about 30 when music hall began, and it didn't get much better because even by music hall in its prime, life expectancy was only 48. So a night out at the music hall, relatively inexpensive, gave the public a little bit of, shall we say, enjoyment. There was some fine entertainment there. Yes, it was baldy, yes, it was rough, and initially, ladies, you didn't go. But when you did start going, of course, the tone grew. It really was our #1 form of entertainment till the moving picture came in. The London music halls, of which there were many, would have artistes, as they were known, who would work 4, 5, 6 halls a night, moving from A to B to C by hansom cab. And my great-grandfather, I'm proud to say, was one of these cabbies, and he worked the West End and across to the East End almost, and I like to think he picked up the odd star. I got involved in all this without really realising before the Second World War. As a little boy in the 30s, Mum and I would spend Saturdays visiting relations because Dad worked. And my favourite trip every third week was the trolley bus. Some of you will remember trolley buses on the tram lines and the overhead arms. Trolley bus to Shepherd's Bush, and the feature of that journey for me was, with any luck, the trolley bus would break down, the arms would crash down on the top, and as a little boy, this was wonderful. I could watch these two guys get this enormous pole to get the old bus going again. I've had a couple of clumps, I remember, because I was so excited by it. The miserable adults, of course, found it pretty awful. But we'd get to Shepherd's Bush. Waiting at Shepherd's Bush would be Auntie and my pal, my cousin, and then we'd all troop across the green to the Shepherd's Bush Empire. Well, going across the green, Mum and Auntie would go through their bags, finding halfpennies and pennies, get enough money for us to get in. This was the matinee performance of what then, strictly speaking, was variety. The main difference with Variety and Music Hall was you didn't have a chairman, but many of the old stars were still appearing. And sadly, I didn't make a note of who I saw. I was young. We'd get in the Shepherd's Bush Empire, and Cousin Charlie and I would be seated on top of what was the shelf at the back of the stalls. Mum and Auntie would lean on the shelf to see the show. I didn't really think about it. We didn't have a seat. It was cheaper. But Charlie and I, instead of facing the stage, had our backs to the stage. Our legs, of course, small though they were, we dare not have them hanging back down lest they kick someone. So I can recall that I was facing the ladies' loo. But as soon as the show started, the music, we would spin round. Now he and I are now coming up the straight for 80. His neck's a bit like that, mine's a bit like that, but when we meet up, we just about manage. That was how it all began for me. For the next 20 or 30 years I continued to go while we had music hall and variety, but it came to an end. I joined the British Music Hall Society. I now, for the last decade almost, have given talks on the subject to likes of yourself, and like you, all my cash goes to charity. So anyway, let's get in the mood for a bit of, this is taking you back to the music hall days with a few medleys from the greatest chorus singer of the music hall days, a big buxom girl. Her name was Florrie Fulton.
We're going back many years to the day Down at the old Bull Bush.
Have the bonfire with me down at the old Bull Bush, bush, bush. It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly. Farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there.
Forgive me for fast forwarding them, but as I say, time is of the essence. A great chorus singer, Florrie Ford. Not only did she perform, she was a great producer of shows. On the Isle of Man, she regularly did their summer show for over 30 years, and she introduced two young chaps who were individual acts. She brought them together, and they became possibly the longest running double act ever. I say possibly. They started in the music hall, and they went on to variety, and you will remember them with singing songs like Underneath the Arches, and they of course were Flanagan and Allen, who many of you are old enough to have seen The Crazy Gang, but they were two performers who attributed much of their success, or certainly the start of it, to Florrie Ford. When my father remarried, we lost mum sadly when she was fairly young, he married a lady who, to my amazement, produced a clock about so big, a beautiful carriage clock, lovely pendulum, very old, and she told me that it was presented to her mother by Florrie Ford, for whom mum had been her dresser. So I was thrilled to hear that. I've got this clock, it's an 1880s clock, you know, with a bit of provenance, a genuine Antiques Roadshow job, and it proudly sits in my little study, still swinging, and I still play Florrie Ford to it. That last number, Tipperary, that Florrie sang, when I did my national service in the early 50s, on a Saturday night, if we were off duty, we'd gather around the old Joanna, as my dad would have called it, and we would sing. I'm sure some of you did the same. And that was a popular number, still being sung, Long Way to Tipperary. But one of my dear friends used to belt out his own version, and it went something like, It's a Long Way to Tickle Mary. Now, I'm sure you've heard that before. When I met Mary after their wedding, and said I was very pleased to meet you, Mary, her face dropped. She isn't Mary, and she is totally convinced that there was some naffy girl with whom he was having an affair. I've never been forgiven, and 50 years have passed, and when I ring them now, I dread her answer, because she says that's that rotten Arthur, and I'm still not Mary. You can't win.
So you haven't found the Mary. You haven't found the Mary yet.
No. We've still got a few music halls left, proper authentic music halls. One of them is near London Dock, where I started work in 1951. It's a lovely old music hall called Wilton. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a listed building. We still have the odd show there. We've got a music hall festival there coming off in September. Roy Howard, our president of the British Musical Society, has organised a big do there for 3 days. It's a lovely old hall. When I found out about it, I couldn't wait to go and have a look at it. This was about 40 years ago. And I knocked on the door. I was told there was a caretaker. This little man opened the door, and I said, I believe this is Wilkington. I can have a look around. No, he said, he slammed the door in my face. I thought of Auntie and Mum going through their pockets to get enough money for entrance to the old Shepherd's Bush Empire. So I did the same, found a couple of bob, knocked again. He opened the door. He said, I told you. I put my hand out. I said, come in. Let me have a look round. Lovely old place. It was knee-deep in old clothing. I think it was a warehouse for clothing then. Very dusty, but a wonderful building. Still there. Mr. Wilton built this theatre on the back of the back gardens of a lot of houses in Well Close Square. as I said, quite near London Dock, and it's a wonderful building. But when I had a good look round, I found a little door halfway down, which was a communicating door to one of the many other buildings around it. And it wasn't a proper entry or an exit, but I found out that the other building to which you could gain entry was a house of ill repute. However, I have it on good authority that none of the patrons went in there, but occasionally the ladies came in to put their feet up and see a bit of a show. It amused me rather because subsequently, when the hall closed down, it was taken over by two other dear ladies who converted it into a Wesleyan chapel. So you've got lovely hymns, which I happen to like, and old musical music, which I adore, all going on in that same building, but not at the same time. When I spoke to the Salvation Army for the first time, I mentioned that General Booth, their founder, had spoken not very well about the music hall, but he did say something like, why should the devil have all the best tunes? The Salvation Army were most amused at this. Of course, they did pinch a lot of our tunes before copyrights and so on. When I left the meeting, I think I'd been to visit them 2 or 3 times, they said to me, we're going to finish with a prayer and what have you, and we're going to play you a number from our songbook. You won't know necessarily the words, but you might know the tune. But I knew they pinched all these tunes, and they played this delightful hymn or song from their songbook, and it was to the tune of The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze. That rather pleased me. Right. The City Varieties Leeds is another music hall some of you will remember from the Good Old Days programme on the television. Still going strong, been refurbished recently. Just about everybody appeared there over the years, and a little boy of 10 or 9 appeared there with an act which was called the 8 Lancashire Lads Clog Dancers, and he didn't do badly for himself. His name was Charlie Chaplin. Topping the bill there in the year 1900 was Charlie Coburn, the man who wrote the Bank of Monte Carlo. Charlie was on stage doing his stuff. Word came through of something important. He went over, they told him about it, he announced it to the crowd. Mafeking has been released. They were delighted. Audience stood up, they shouted, and they wanted more and more. Charlie was top of the bill, 30 quid a week he was getting. He'd started on the Isle of Dogs at £0.50. So he really progressed. He's doing his stuff, and he's watching the side because management, if you overran, you were in trouble. They'd have 2 guys come out with a long pole with a hook on the end. You'd go round your waist, and you were off. Charlie knew this, but he was top of the bill, and he felt, they won't do it to me. And they didn't. And he went on and on. Audience loved it. They didn't want him to sit down. But when he finally did give up, management dragged him off. They were livid. In the Black Book went his name, and it was said he never appeared there again. Over the proscenium arch there, they discovered when they were refurbishing the Prince of Wales coat of arms. Turned out that Edward VII, before he was Edward VII, was Prince of Wales, was a regular frequenter of that music hall. Absolutely true. He always had his own box, Box D, with the curtains drawn, because as you know, he did have a lot of lady friends who no doubt weren't always the same when he went there, and it was suggested that he didn't want to be seen. The real truth came out later when it was written that his mother, Queen Victoria, detested the music hall, thought it was only for the proletariat, and had she known that a future King of England, her son, was there, he'd have been in for it apparently. But there we are. Well, the next little number I've got for you rather, a bit quick. He belts the tunes out. His name is Harry Champion. I won't promise you he can sing, but he didn't do badly on the music hall. You're looking at that as you look at me. I'm a bit of a knob, I am belong to royalty. I tell you how we got about, I'm married widow bird. I'm a king of England when we trotted down to church. Outside the people started shouting in hooray. Said I go down upon your knees in coronation day. I'm in a really eighth, I am. In a really eighth, I am. I got married to the widow next door. She's been married 7 times before. Everyone was an enemy. She wouldn't
never will you understand. I'm a late old man named Henry, Henry the Eighth I am named. It was the never will you understand. I'm when I was a little 6 months old, my mother and my father too. They didn't know what to weep beyond, they were in the dreadful stew. They thought of this, they thought of that, got a little bit of all gone row. I just popped round to the old bookshop and I tell you what'll make me growl. Boiled beef and carrots, boiled beef and carrots. That's the stuff you don't be tell, it makes you better, it keeps you well and live like vegetarians on food they give the parrots. From morning to low at your kind on boiled beef and carrots. I'm the father of a lovely pair of little big fat boys. They're twins, you can't tell which is which, like a pair of seven boys. We had been christened yesterday, Parson took 'em on his knee. I said to them, but got ginger ale, I want their names to beef. Boiled beef and carrots, boiled beef and carrots. That's the stuff for your Derby Kitty, it makes you better, it keeps you well and live like vegetarians. Food they give the parrots, from morning I blow at you kind of boiled beef and carrots.
Harry Champion. Little lady in Suffolk, when I played that, it was her 90th birthday, and she sat in front of me. When I put that on, her feet didn't reach the ground. Delightful little lady. When I put Harry on, her feet went like the clappers. When I'd finished, she put her little hand up, tiny little lady she was. She said, "Excuse me, can I ask a question?" I said, "Yes, of course." She said, that man, he kept talking about Derby Kell. Can you tell me what that means?" I said, "Yes, madam." I said, "Derby Kelly is rhyming slang for belly." "Oh," she said, but I did like him. Harry Champion, he'd come out, swing his gold watch with his Albert, drop it into his pocket of what he called his waistcoat if he could. Jimmy Edwards, you may recall, pinched that idea, did that on television. Difference was, when Harry did it, if it went in his pocket, a cloud of almost smoke would go up, and Harry would just put his finger in his pocket and say, "Excuse me, folks, best snuff." That was Harry Champion. I could go on about Harry all night, but we haven't got time. The music hall is best remembered for the songs it's left us. Those you've just heard, if you're interested, were recorded. They're some of my new ones. They were recorded about 90 years ago. But there were stars who really were mega stars. Perhaps my favourite is a man who's left us with some songs, but nobody's ever heard of them. They're comedy numbers. But as a performer, he was absolutely tops. He was known as the giant of the music hall. His name was Harry Relf. Nobody will have heard of that. But he appeared on stage as Little Titch, the big boot dancer. Little Titch was 4'6". His boots, which I've had in my hands, or at least a pair of them, were 2'3" long. So he had them made half. And he would come out and do the most delightful dance in them. He'd stand over the orchestra pit and he'd sway and he'd get the audience going. He'd have half of them shouting for him to fall in, and the other half trying to stop him. And he would then sort of come right over an impossible angle. He'd recoil, go up on his toes, he'd shoot into the air. Like a ballerina, he'd go round. Then he'd give a sign, they'd throw him a cane and a couple of hats, and he'd flick the hats and they would spin all round him and he would chase them. Absolutely incredible that. He really was wonderful. I've got some film of him. He is so funny that I left it on only about 2 or 3 years ago for my 2 granddaughters. They were arriving and my wife said, "Take that off." I said, "No, let the girls see it." I was doing an article on music hall for a magazine, and I just got this on as a bit of background. They came in, the girls, I suppose then they were about 18 and 20. They're a bit older now. Looked at this black and white little man doing the dance, and I said he was funny. They almost smiled. Well, that's not bad, is it? Little Titch, tremendous performer. He, sorry I keep looking at my watch, but I've never had to gabble so much in such a short time. Little Titch, he made hundreds of pounds a week when he was in his prime. This little boy was the 16th child. Don't think about that too long, ladies. 16th child, but Dad did have 2 wives, each of whom had 8 kiddies apparently. He was a brilliant scholar, left school at 12 because his dad wanted him to work, but he didn't like Dad because his father had he felt ridiculed him. As a little boy, he was put on the bar in a pub in Kent where Dad worked, and he was a spectacle. Little Titch, I should tell you, was born with an extra digit on each finger. They were webbed hands, he had a gammy leg, he didn't have much going for him as a boy. And people would come and stare at this little chap. Today they whip the finger off apparently at birth. But Titch grew up with a sort of a thing about this, and he always said he wished he'd have been normal height. By golly, it did not stop him as a performer. When he was in his peak and earning hundreds of pounds a week, someone said to him, "Do you realise, Titch, you're all over the world, America, the continent." This little chap, by the way, learned 5 languages after leaving school. He really was bright. But he made his money on the halls. "Do you realise, Titch," they said, "you're earning more than twice as much as the Prime Minister?" Titch thought about it. Well, he said, "Might be earning a bit more than the Prime Minister," he said, "but goodness me," he said, "I do so much less harm." Some of you will remember an act that I saw as a little boy, and I saw them last in the late 50s, and they were a trio of sand dancers doing Cleopatra's Nightmare. I'm sure some of you will remember the great Wilson, Keppel and Betty. When I first saw Betty, well, I probably didn't notice too much. By the time I got to 12, maybe 14, and when it was 17, well, those legs went on forever. She had tassels hanging from everywhere. I could not take my eyes off. Little did I realise there have been 12 Bettys. The last of the Bettys is my age, and I'm hoping to meet her very shortly at a gathering. She told a lovely story about Wilson, Keppel and Betty. When they turned up at one particular boarding house in the provinces, they gave their free tickets out to the landlady for the Monday night performance. End of the week they went to pay. She hadn't said anything about going. As the boys were about to leave, they said, did you come?" "Oh," she said, "I forgot to tell you. It was a wonderful show." She said, "You didn't tell me you were top of the bill with your funny dancing." And they smiled, and as they went to go out the door, she said, "Had I known you were top of the bill, I'd have given you clean sheets." Wilson, Keppel and Betty, if you didn't see them, very quickly, the boys would come out like this. There'd be a bucket of sand and a roll of matting. The matting would go down, hand would go in the sand, sprinkled on there, and they do their wonderful sand dance. Someone would shout out, "Genuine Sahara sand, specially imported." That was rubbish. It was probably bought from Wicks. But that was the act. They were like close together. Sometimes the men would wear fezzes like Cooper did later. Sometimes they would wear smocks, knobbly knees, never smiled. But they were an absolute dream act, and on a Saturday night at the Shepherd's Bush Empire, where I used to go, and the Chiswick Empire, every week there'd be someone trying to emulate Wilson, Keppel and Betty with a wonderful sand dance. But there we are. Well, I know, conclude shortly, so I better quickly move on to the Queen of the Music Hall, Miss Marie Lloyd. I'm just going to give you a little burst of her. Have I got time, sir?
Yes, just
I'll just give you a little verse of Marie Lloyd. This record, it sounds it's over 100 years old, but it's a little of what you...
She does you good.
Ah, right. Sorry about that. Marie Lloyd, the Queen of the Music Hall, earned up to £1,000 a week in her prime. She was generous to a fault. She She hated the poverty that she saw around her in London. Often her money went straight to the local orphanage at the end of the road. She bought boots and shoes for all the kids in the district. She really had a heart of gold, but she was always in trouble on the music hall. She said, they reckon, risque things. She said and sang rude songs. She would come on the stage and she'd look at the audience. She was not a tiny lady, she was quite stocky, but she was very dainty on her feet, did a wonderful little dance. Audiences adored her, but with a wink and a nod, she absolutely held them. But she'd come on and she'd look at them all and she'd say, "I've never had my ticket punched before." And there'd be a roar. God knows what she was inferring, but they knew what she was inferring, and so did she. And that was typical Mari. Imagine my surprise when I went to go back to my granddaughters. When one of them was only 10, I was at my son's and I could hear her singing in a beautifully clear voice, "Oh, Mr. Porter." I looked at my son and he shook his head. When she came out, I said, "Eleanor, that song." She thrust out her little chest. It's a lot bigger now. And she thrust out her little chest and she said, "Grandad, that's a Victorian pop song." I said, "Is it?" She said, "Yes." She said, I said, "Wow, that's very interesting." And then she said, "I know another one." I said, "Let's hear it." Away she went with "My Old Man." I said to her, "Those two songs, dear." She said, "We're singing them in the school production." I said, "Good." She said, "And we're learning all about Victoria and Edwardian England." She said, I said, "Those two songs were by the most famous musical artist ever." She looked at me. I said, "She was as famous as any of your pop stars." She thrust out her chest. She said, "As famous as Madonna?" So I sort of ummed and ahed at that, and then I said, "Well, tell me, if you learnt those two songs, did they tell you her name?" And she looked at me with a grin and she said, "Well, no, Grandad. But after all, it was really your era." Just to finally finish, because I know I've overrun, Mari's famous story that got her into trouble, there's lots I could talk about Mari for hours, but I mustn't, got her into trouble was when she sang a song and it was about her garden and she had a line in it where she sang, "I sits among the lettuces and leeks." And peas, I've messed it up, haven't I? "I sit among the lettuces and peas," she said. My apologies. So of course they told her she couldn't do it, so when she appeared the next night, she said, they thought she won't sing the song, and she did. But she sang, "I sits among the cabbages and leeks." If only I'd have got that the right way around. But I really will finish with this story. When she appeared at Sheffield, she couldn't believe it. She went on stage, a big star, and they started to heckle, and she wasn't used to this. But she thought, "Well, I'll carry on." She carried on, and it didn't get any better. Well, she's thinking to herself, first night in Sheffield, there won't be a second. And she carried on and she saw it through, but the noise did not subside. When she'd finished, she was livid. She started to leave the stage and it went quiet. She turned around, she did something very unprofessional. She went back and she looked at the audience and she said, "Well," she said, "you people of Sheffield, you may not be very fond of me." And she said, "Well, I'm not very fond of you," but I suspect it was Mari Lloyd's vernacular that she used. A little bit stronger. She said, "You may be very good here at making your knives and forks and cutlery and your circular saws. As far as I'm concerned, you can stuff them all where the sun doesn't shine." And she turned and left. She'd hardly got back in her dressing room and there was a, "Come in!" She opened. The door was open and the manager came in, very, very worried. "Miss Lloyd, Miss Lloyd," said, "I'm so sorry." And she looked at him. "I'm not going on tomorrow." Miss Lloyd," he said, "I've come on behalf of the audience and management to apologise." So she said, "Oh, yes," he said, "and what's more, I have a message from the audience." She said, "A message?" "Yes," he said. He said, "The audience is quite prepared to do exactly what you said with the knives and forks, etc., but could you forgive them the circular saws?" Thank you very much.
When Ron said we've got someone talking about Taste of Musical, I said, "What, at enormous expense?" He said, no, it won't be. Up and down like a lead balloon. Unfortunately, I mean, it's fantastic for your knowledge of musical, and it's marvellous that someone like yourself can go and preach this to youngsters who obviously are
Like yourself.
who know nothing at all about it, and keep it going, because without people like you, it would just completely die and no one would ever know anything what happened. I like the old day High Fidelity. I thought that was brilliant at the end. Anyway, it's your knowledge is obviously fantastic, and you could talk for hours and hours and hours. Perhaps, maybe, come back one evening and give us a talk which can last a little bit longer. But if all the chaps would like to thank you in the usual way, and thank you.